Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be moving forward with Module 5, Part 2, where we're going into the immune system, specifically looking at the first part of this conversation, which is all about your innate immunity, so what we are born with in terms of our immunity. So we have two mechanisms that actually make up our immune system in total, help us defend from foreign materials that could be potentially dangerous for our bodies and its function. We have our innate, you can refer to that as your non-specific defense system. This is the one that you are born with. It is innate from birth. And then you have your adaptive or more specific defense system. This is typically the one that we develop with time, requires exposure to certain things to have a response and then to remember how to respond to it later. When I use the word immunity, this is just talking about any specific resistance to disease. Okay, so innate and adaptive both fall under that umbrella of immunity. And so also we need to understand that the immune system is really a functional system rather than an organ system purely, right? Because we're not really talking about a system of organs, we're really talking about a system of specific mechanisms or cells and their responses within all organ systems. And we're going to go through the first two columns that you see today for your innate or non-specific defense mechanisms. We're going to be talking about our first line and our second lines of defense. And then in part 3, we'll go in more specifically into the specific defense system or your adaptive immune system. And that's going to be your third and hopefully final line of defense necessary. So we're going to start with our first line of defense. We'll go through what we mean by that and how these structures contribute. And then we'll go into our second and we'll, give some time to understanding these different types of cells, proteins, and our responses, such as inflammation and fever. Again, whenever we talk about innate defense system, we're saying this is what responds immediately to protect the body from all foreign materials. It is immediate response. Includes your skin, your mucous membranes, your inflammatory response, and other various proteins. The adaptive or more specific or developed immune system, it fights invaders that happen to get past those first and second lines of defense for your innate system. And it requires time. It requires exposure to each type of invader. And this highly specific resistance to disease is what we would actually refer to as immunity. So we have our immune systems, but the specific resistance to a specific disease is an immunity to that disease. And if you would like, I've provided these. You can feel free. It breaks down all of our primary structures. So we have these categories or associated elements. Again, you have your skin itself as a first line of defense. You have these various mucous membranes. What I would encourage you to do is on each of these slides, hit pause and look through just really quickly on what protective mechanisms each of these structures use to contribute to that first line of defense, right? So for example, you can think of skin as forming a mechanical barrier, right? You can think of the acid mantle, right? Which is all of those secretions that are made by your skin. You can say, oh, well, what does that do? Well, it inhibits bacterial growth on the surface because the surface is relatively acidic. And so you can go through each of these and just hit pause and make sure that we understand in what way each of these elements are contributing. This is the first slide. I believe there are two for your second line of defense. This is, again, where you're going into elements like your phagocytes, your natural killer cells, and your body's ability to have an inflammatory response. Go ahead and hit pause, and I want you guys to review what these protective mechanisms are and how they operate. And finally, you've got these additional elements. You have your antimicrobial chemicals. These are two types of proteins that we're going to discuss later, and your body's ability to run a fever and what that is actually accomplishing as well. You can feel free to go ahead and hit pause and review those in a little more detail. All right, so we're going to break down a little bit more of the detail for some of these elements. We have your first line of defense, which is all of those surface membrane barriers, right? So the skin and the mucous membranes that help basically just ward off any sort of penetration from these foreign invasions or these microorganisms. You have these protective secretions that basically you have acidic skin that inhibits bacterial growth. Mucus is actually there, like sticky mucus, to help trap any sort of microorganisms or foreign particles. You have gastric juices and other acidic substances that actually kill pathogens. And then you have different enzymes that are released in these secretions or these mucosa in order to break down and destroy different types of bacteria. As far as cells go, we do have cells and other chemicals that provide that second line of defense. These include your natural killer cells, your phagocytes, your ability to have inflammatory responses to injury or to foreign substances that need to be addressed. You have chemicals and the ability to run a fever. We're going to discuss those in a little more detail. And then we've got okay, so let's start with your natural killer cells. These are cells that roam the body throughout your blood circulation and your lymph vessels. Your natural killer cells ultimately will lyse or burst and kill cancer cells, other virus-infected cells, and non-specific targeted cells that it recognizes as other than or foreign. These natural killer cells function by releasing certain chemicals that will actually degrade the target cell contents, rendering them ineffective, and those cells will then, again, burst or recycle their contents. And then it also happens to release really powerful inflammatory chemicals, so we can bring in a lot in that inflammatory response in order to address any sort of foreign substances. Very, very important whenever we are addressing any sort of like cancer or virus specifically. And then we want to break down the specifics of our inflammatory response, right? This is one of the big parts of your innate immunity. This is what you are born with, the ability to have this type of response to these types of conditions. So whenever we're talking about an inflammatory response, we have to understand that this is always going to be triggered when any of your body tissues become injured in some way. So this is going to happen when cells of those tissues become damaged. And this is going to cause a release of what we call kinins, histamine, other chemicals, and this has a variety of different effects that we will cover. Main thing that we want to understand is these 4 or really 5 cardinal signs of acute inflammation, to include the area is going to become red, warm to the touch, so there's increased levels of heat in the area. Pain upon touch is going to be expected, as well as swelling or edema. Also important to understand that there is a 5th possible one where if the inflammation happens to be occurring in a joint, then that joint, because of the pain and swelling, you're going to experience some limitation of that joint's ability to move. So that inflammatory response, what is its function? It's going to help prevent the spread of any sort of damaging agents to spreading to nearby areas. We don't want that. We want to keep it centrally located so we can deal with it there. It's going to help dispose of any cell debris or pathogens that we do no longer, or that we no longer need if those are cell debris, and we don't want in our system if those are the pathogens that we initially set out to address. And it's also going to, in effect, set the stage for tissue repair. The process is that first you're going to see that we have neutrophils which migrate to that area of inflammation. So they're going to enter the blood from bone marrow. They roll along the vessel wall until they sense that this is an area in which I am needed. They'll squeeze through those capillary walls by a process called diapedesis, and that will take them to the tissue where inflammation is occurring. And then neutrophils gather in those precise sites of tissue injury, and they consume any foreign material present in order to basically diffuse any sort of inflammatory chemicals. We have this process called phagocytosis, and if you would like, you can look over to the right here where you see a step-by-step process for what this looks like. Very, very easy to understand and to conceptualize if we look at how each part of this process works in order to basically have these neutrophils or macrophages engulf and neutralize or diffuse these foreign particles. You've got clotting proteins that are responsible for walling off damaged areas. You have local heat in these inflammatory areas where increased levels of heat up to a point will help speed up the rate of metabolism and repair, which is what we want. And then, you have your phagocytes, which are all about engulfing and then, basically breaking down whatever sort of foreign body has been consumed, and it will basically neutralize it and then release any sort of indigestible or residual waste from that process back into the system to either be expelled as a waste product or to be recycled and used elsewhere. We've got antimicrobial proteins. These come in two forms. Those are your complement proteins as well as your interferons. These basically will help enhance your innate defense. They help attack certain microorganisms directly. They also hinder any sort of reproduction of microorganisms. So they both attack ones that they notice and they also stop them from proliferating. Complement proteins, this refers to a group of at least 20 different plasma proteins. They're constantly circulating in your blood plasma. They become activated whenever they encounter and attach to certain cells, right? So this is called complement fixation. So they fixate on certain types of cells that they can actually address. You have these membrane attack complexes, or MACs for short, which result from this complement fixation. Basically, what they're going to do is they're going to puncture and produce holes or these pores in the cells that they're attacking, and these pores allow a whole lot of water to rush in, and then basically these cells that are being attacked end up bursting because they overfill with water. So these activated complement proteins basically will help to enhance the inflammatory response that we've been referring to. And this shows you a visual of how this works, like three-step process, where we have these activated complement proteins. They attach to the membrane in this sequence. They basically form this complex. A pore is basically created in that membrane, which will now allow for a whole lot of water to rush in. And once all of this water rushes in and it overloads the interior of the cell, that cell will burst from the inside. We've got these interferons, which are small proteins that are actually going to be secreted by virus-infected cells. Main thing here is that this is like a cell's cry for help. They won't be able to save themselves, but it's kind of a really selfless effort where that cell is caring about all the cells in the tissue around it. And so it will actually secrete this small protein to let the surrounding cells know that it has been infected by a foreign virus. And then basically these interferons will bind to the membrane receptors on those healthy surfaces to interfere with any further proliferation of the virus. So it's like you got one of us, maybe two of us, but you're not going to get the rest of us. Interferons interfere with the virus going further than what it already has. The virus will still be able to override and to utilize the resources of the cells that it got, but it won't be able to move any further. And so we've addressed the further spread of that virus. Got to understand, though, that these interferons, they don't necessarily address bacteria or any sort of fungal infections, just viral. And we're going to finish up here with a very common and relatable innate immune response to any sort of sickness or disease, which is to run fevers. This fever is referring to an abnormally high blood pressure. It's a systemic response due to some invasion of a microorganism that is a foreign component. The hypothalamus is the structure that is responsible for normally regulating our body temperature. That's at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It's where we're going to stay, more or less. The hypothalamus acts as a thermostat, but it can be reset by these pyrogens, which pyro, it means heat, right? So it can actually be reset by these white blood cells that are circulating in response to in some immune response. And these high temperatures, they do a couple of things. The increased temperature is going to increase the metabolic and overall speed of repair processes. And it can also inhibit any further release of iron and zinc, both of which would normally be needed by bacteria. And so the liver and spleen will actually no longer inhibit the iron and zinc, will no longer release the iron and zinc. And so these bacteria essentially will starve without those necessary components. So that's what your fever is doing. It's also important, as one final afterthought, going back to that aspect of heat whenever it comes to inflammatory responses or fever. While these inflammatory responses and fevers are not always comfortable, they are absolutely necessary in order to address something that would ultimately lead to something much less comfortable, right? Or even fatal. And so whenever it comes to an inflammatory response, we commonly have our RICE method, right? Where you rest and you ice the area of inflammation, you compress that area of inflammation, and you elevate the area. It's important to understand that one of the normal parts of the process is this aspect of increased heat or temperature to speed up the process of repair. And so we really want to keep in mind that whenever we're addressing any sort of injury or fever, we want to only utilize cold compresses or ice if we need to for the sake of pain management. Any administering of ice or cold compress to an area is ultimately going to delay the overall process of repair. So we want to only use that cold compression or that ice administration sparingly. And so this is actually going to close us out for part 2, where we discussed all of the inner workings of our innate immune system, or the immune system that we're born with. We're going to finish off this module with part 3 lecture at the next one, and so we'll see you there.